So this week in our Mythic Plus recap is pretty weird, because once we go and look once more at the situation in Mythic Plus after a week since the last time we looked at this, initially it feels like not much is moving, not much is changing, things seems to be mostly the same. When we look for tanks, for example, in keys at plus 20 or higher, the situation is mostly the same. Yes, Prot Paladin loses another 2% overall, but you still see more or less the same representation of tanks. When you look at the situation for healers, again, they are mostly in the same position that they were last week, and the same goes for the melee and for the range DPS. So there isn't really much changing at first glance. You still have more or less the same popular specs. When you look at the DPS, you have Red Paladin, you have Subtlety Rogue, Shadow Priest, and then some other specs sprinkled in. Maybe it's Balanced Druid, maybe it's Fury, maybe it's Havoc, etc, etc. Where we do get something a little bit more interesting is that when you start looking at the very high key levels, and those are important because those create the trickle-down effect, those create the situation where average, normal players see, for example, streamers, see videos on YouTube, they see comments from top players playing a certain spec, and they get some ideas, they get some hints. For example, why? When we look at the highest keys completed right now, we have a surprisingly high number of Vengeance, Demon Hunters, and Guardian Druids. Once again, if we go back to the plus 20 keys, they don't really look that high, they don't really look like they were growing that much, and also they still looked like they were behind Blood Death Knight and more or less tied or even with Brewmaster Monk and Prot Warrior. So why exactly do we have a growth, for example, for these two specs? The growth of Vengeance Demon Hunter is the most unique one out of the two tanks, because compared to last season, which was this one was the general build of Vengeance Demon Hunter in Season 1. They were playing down the left side of their talent tree, they were playing around the frailty and damage, stacking, vulnerability on the enemy, and not really going down the right side, the fire damage, fiery brand, duration, extension, multiple charges of firebrand, etc, etc. Then this season we do have essentially a split. You do have a couple of different options. You have the side that goes for firebrand and still goes down the middle for Fell Devastation and the Cheat Death at the bottom, last resort, or the other type of build which still goes for the firebrand damage but ditches the middle, ditches Fell Devastation, ditches the Cheat Death, and still goes down the left side. Either way, the result is the same. All of these builds are still taking down the fire side, the fiery brand side of their talent tree compared to Season 1. The reason for this, besides a few buffs and talent changes that happened at the beginning of Season 2, the reason for this is because their tier set is enabling this type of build. This is thanks to their set bonus, the 2-piece set bonus, which increases their fire damage, stacking over time. So of course, Firebrand doing fire damage increases that effect. And then more importantly, the 4-piece set bonus. Every 20 soul fragments spent, your next shear or fracture will apply Firebrand for 6 seconds to its target. Now, Firebrand is of course the be-all end-all of this build. Firebrand makes you take 40% less damage from the target affected by Firebrand. It does a whole bunch of damage. It does have a whole bunch of synergies in the talent setup you're using now to spread it as much as possible and extend the duration of Firebrand as much as possible. This results in a pretty high damage of Firebrand, while you still continue to do quite a lot of damage with Spirit Bomb anyways, but with this new type of build, your damage has been increased as well, down to the point where at the moment Vengeance Demon Hunter is amongst, or perhaps the highest damage dealing tank in Mythic Plus. What also gives them another edge compared to previous other tanks that were known for their damage is that their damage is also still consistent in single target. So in single target, not just in AoE, Vengeance is still the better tank in terms of damage. So it looks like over time, some players might have realized, maybe, you know, many players have stopped raiding, they cleared the raid, now it's time to look around, maybe start trying to play different specs and different classes. Some of those top level tanks still playing Protection Paladin, they started looking around, found Vengeance Demon Hunter, and now it seems like we have more and more of these types of tanks trying out and finding pretty good success with Vengeance Demon Hunter. The other tank that is doing quite better compared to their usual self is Guardian Druid. While their situation is not nearly as good as Vengeance at the moment, still does follow some similar gains in power, because overall, the increase of Guardian Druid doesn't really have to do with some change in talents like we saw for Vengeance. This is the old version, the Season 1 version of the talents for Guardian, and this is the Season 2 version of the talents for Guardian. You are not blind, there is simply basically no difference between the two. They are still doing the same thing, they are still playing with Rage of the Sleeper, they are still playing with Incarnation as their two final points, and now they are still playing around with Thorns of Iron for more reflective damage, and moved slightly away from doing more arcane damage by not taking Elun's favor. That's basically most of the time the main difference from the two different seasons. So why do we suddenly have more tanks playing Guardian? They have been helped in terms of damage done thanks to their 2-piece set bonus. You do have basically a permanent 15% damage increase to your Thrash, which you can make to do some pretty good AoE damage. The passive defensiveness of healing for 6% of the damage taken over 8 seconds, and then the 4-piece set bonus, further increasing your damage, this time mostly in single targets since most players don't take raise, and then the massive tankiness increase of giving you maximum health percentage stacking 5 times, which equals to a 15% max HP as a tank, which is very good. This has put them also in a position where their single target damage is very good, very close to Vengeance Demon Hunter and the better of the tank's damage at the moment when it comes to single target, but also still their AoE damage has gotten significantly better compared to before. They do have more overall damage while still doing quite a lot of damage with Moonfire. Now their Thrash damage, also thanks to their set bonus, has been increased. They still do quite a lot of damage of Thorns of Iron, and as we checked a few days ago, they are still one of the tanks going for Primordial Stones for gaining more damage over a course of a key. And at the moment, for example, these are Protection Paladins in plus 24 keys. I think this is Bracken Knight Hollow or something like that. And the average DPS of the top tanks you can see for Prot is around 73 to 74,000 DPS. And this one is the average damage of the top 10 Guardian Druids in the same level of key, which is around 81,000 DPS. So now they are also out damaging Protection Paladin as a tank. Also Vengeance is also out damaging Protection Paladin as a tank. We also have Brewmaster Monk, who is out damaging Protection Paladin as a tank. So we are definitely in a situation where we might start seeing some changes over time in the tanks department for this season, which is good, right? Even more variety, even more diversity for the Mythic Plus compositions. We are already seeing some changes in the compositions in Mythic Plus. As you can see here, the most popular comps this week have been popping up with more and more Vengeance Demon Hunters over time, compared to just the usual pink line of Protection Paladin. Now for healers, on the other hand, we have mentioned this already, despite Restoration Shaman continuing to be overall the more popular. So once you start looking at higher keys and the composition of the healers, you do start seeing more and more diversity. For example, these are the top keys at the moment in Mythic Plus, and you can see that despite Resto Shaman technically being the more popular healer in high keys, when you look at this, you do see that it's quite diverse. It's happily diverse. You see also the tanks being very diverse in the top level of keys, and so are the healers. As a matter of fact, funnily enough, despite Resto Shaman being the most popular one, they are below Resto Druid in terms of player numbers, they are below Holy Paladin, and they are below Preservation Evoker. You do have quite the variety and quite the options in the higher level of keys, despite what the general popularity might suggest for for Resto Shaman. So, you know, boringly enough for DPS players, this has been a week with more interesting movements for the tanks and even the healers than for the DPS. We are not really getting that many thing changes in terms of DPS. We're not getting some hipster, niche, underdog story of a DPS rising from the ashes. At the moment, the status quo of DPS players and specs remains mostly the same. You still have a lot of stocks put in specs like Fury, Red Paladin and Subtlety Rogue for the melee DPS, and then mostly Shadow Priest for the range DPS. So for today, most of the changes are focused on taking a closer look, paying a little bit more attention to what's gonna happen in the next few weeks to both Vengeance Demon Hunter and Guardian Druid, to see if things will continue to change in the positive for these two specs when it comes to tanks. But for today, this is all we have for this update on this week of Mythic Plus, as we are about to end this tyrannical reset. So thanks of course as usual to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still support in plenty of free ways. You can like and comment down below on this video, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. And lastly, you can follow me over on my Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, my Hopium was misplaced. My Hopium for Guardian Druid was in Season 2 of Shadowlands. I was 2 years early.